Hey guys, it's me, Luca. Welcome to my humble abode. As you can see, I've gone all out with the decorations today, because today I want to talk to you guys about someone who I think is one of the most interesting figures in the sort of larger Western canon of social and political thought. And some of you comics fans might have guessed, but that man is Thomas Hobbes. Specifically, I want to talk about um, the work that I think is largely considered to be his most important, most influential in sort of the Western political canon, and that's Leviathan. My main claim for today is that with regards to his ideas in human nature and on social cooperation, Thomas Hobbes holds ultimately a very pessimistic and cynical outlook on humanity as a whole. This claim will be supported by three main reasons. The first is that Hobbes believes that we're fundamentally selfish creatures. And actually, the first two kind of tie together because, in addition to him believing that we're very motivated by our own sort of selfish ends, Hobbes believes that we're very driven by fear. And he, in a lot of the same quotes, he sort of backs up both claims. So those will be kind of tied together just for the purposes of both time, because we got to keep this kind of under 8 minutes, and just because I think they're very linked, sort of, especially when he talks about them. And the third claim, or really sort of the second claim, first one's a little larger, is that Hobbes doesn't think humans can really exist peacefully without this sort of supreme overarching leader, this sovereign, that's going to keep them in line through essentially cruelty and tyranny. And so yeah, that's the point of this vlog. I'm going to run you through exactly why I think Hobbes has ultimately a very cynical and a very negative view of humanity. So let's get started. My first claim is that Hobbes has a pessimistic view of humanity because he believes us to be inherently selfish creatures. To understand how exactly I've arrived to that interpretation, we must look at how Hobbes treats human nature in Leviathan. Hobbes talks about humans as being in this sort of like state of nature, one which we're left sort of entirely to our own reason, our own faculties to sort of govern ourselves. And it's very revealing that Hobbes believes that if we're sort of just left to our own judgment, our own devices, that will not play out well, and we'll see why. Hobbes claims sort of that humans... So, in the state of nature, it doesn't really go well for humanity, and that's because Hobbes believes that we have, as humans, sort of natural inclination towards one thing, and that's power. In chapter 11 of Leviathan, Hobbes claims that humans have a quote-unquote perpetual and restless desire of power after power that ceaseth only in death. And, he says that the cause of this sort of fear and this constant desire for power is because he quote, cannot assure the power and means to live well without the acquisition of more. So it's less that humans are just constantly in it for this greed, this avaricious just lust for power. I mean, that's part of it. But the main motivator of that is that we're afraid that we'll lose out on all of our power if we don't sort of command a lot more of it. Like, if you're not gaining, you're losing. And there's this sort of constant fear and pressure that in a state of nature, because there's no higher authority, Hobbes believes humanity will essentially be like dogs. They'll try to kill each other. And a big reason that they're so apt to kill each other is because Hobbes thinks that we're all, and this is an important point, that we're all roughly equal. That human beings, some of us are stronger, some of us are faster, some of us are more athletic, some of us read a lot as kids. Regardless of that, in the state of nature, and even outside of the state of nature, or in a commonwealth, humans' abilities are roughly equal. They're roughly the same. Some are stronger, some are smarter, but ultimately it kind of levels out. If you're stronger, you're probably not faster. If you're faster, you're probably not that strong. If you're smart, you're probably not too keen on physical ability. It all balances out. And he backs that up with I can back that up here with the text where he says, nature had made man so equal in the faculties of body and mind as though there be found one man sometimes manifestly stronger in body or of quicker mind than another. Yet when all is reckoned together, the difference between man and man is not so considerable as that one can thereupon claim to himself any benefit to which another man may not pretend, as well as he. For as to the strength of body, the weakest has strength enough to kill the strongest, either by secret machination or by confederacy with others that are in the same danger with himself. And so Hobbes believes that because we're in that state of nature and we're left to our own faculties and we're roughly, sort of equal, that creates sort of this perfect storm where we all believe that we can attain our own selfish ends quite easily. And that fosters this selfishness and this to flourish. And so he also says that, from this equality of ability ariseth equality of hope in the attaining of our ends. And therefore, if any two men desire the same thing, which nevertheless they cannot both enjoy, they become enemies, and in that way to their end endeavor to destroy or subdue one another. So, this means a lot. Basically, Hobbes is saying that, instead of equality fostering, like you would think, this sort of brotherhood of man, that in the state of nature, I don't want to play with my hair too much. In the state of nature, humans are just gonna murder each other. They want that power. They have that sort of selfish desire to come out on top, and because they're so driven by that fear, Hobbes presents it as the ultimate fear being the fear of death. Then they'd rather prioritize their own benefit rather than sort of they'd rather essentially end another human being's life if it means assuaging those fears and if it means meeting their own selfish ends. So I think that's honestly a rather pessimistic view of humanity. I think that's why, that's the first thing that really led me to start thinking Hobbes has a very negative view on humans. He thinks we can't really exist in nature without it being essentially a slaughter fest. And part of the reason, but it's also important to note that Hobbes doesn't think we really like this state of nature. He thinks that in order to escape that fear, humanity has devised this sort of power-sharing agreement, this commonwealth. We might call it like a government or a society. And what that essentially means, according to Hobbes, is that human beings give up their power, or a little bit of that power, in order to sort of attain security. So everybody, all human, or sort of large sections of humanity, because it can't be small groups, sort of agree to lay down their power to a sovereign. And that sovereign, Hobbes says, can take three forms. It can be a monarchy, in which that sovereign is one man, a oligarchy, in which it's just a few guys, which I argue we have, and a democracy, in which power is vested in sort of a larger council, larger representative council. And so that sort of concept of the sort of creation of the commonwealth, in which the sovereign has essentially not unquestioned power, but very strong amounts of power in order to best make decisions for how humanity is going to live. Hobbes says that we do that because of that sort of fear motivation, that idea that if we don't, we will get murdered by each other, and it'll sort of descend into what Hobbes calls a state of war, which is not exactly war as we think of it. It's not, like World War II, everyone's shooting each other. It's not army is not a battlefield necessarily. It's just any state in which man thinks that it's likely that his fellow man will try to kill him. So it's just this sort of not only just conflict, but this state in which we think conflict can arise. He compares it to sort of rainy weather, where he thinks that we say it's rainy outside, not just when it rains, but when we have sort of this natural inclination that bad weather will happen. And I know some of you might be thinking, well, okay, Lugo, I think you're a little hard on humanity, or I think Hobbes isn't really as hard on humanity as you think. Isn't sort of the fact that Hobbes believes humans are capable of setting aside some of their desire for power, doesn't that prove some level of selflessness? After all, Hobbes does believe that humans are so strongly motivated for power. If that's true, then isn't it optimistic of him to say that we're willing to set aside some of that and create sort of a very reasonable society? Isn't that sort of a hopeful outlook on humanity? And to that I'd say that yes, humans are willing to create that sort of civil society, but I think it's important to realize that according to Hobbes, humans don't really do this out of any other sort of common love. This isn't out of some sort of kumbaya appreciation for other human beings. It's the primary goal of this commonwealth, as Hobbes even says, is selfish reasons. It is. I mean, in the text he says, the first paragraph of chapter, I think 12, where he introduces, or not 13, where he introduces the concept of the Commonwealth. Hobbes says, opening paragraph, the final cause, end, or design of men in the introduction of that restraint upon themselves, in which we see them live in commonwealths, is the foresight of their own preservation, and of a more contented life thereby, that is to say, of getting themselves out of the miserable condition of war. And of course, we talked about that being more conflict than actual war necessarily. And that's sort of the root of what Hobbes thinks fosters social cooperation. That it's not brotherly love, it's not these sort of lofty ideals that a lot of his contemporaries thought of. Hobbes takes a more cynical view. It's preservation, it's selfishness, it's fear of death. These are the ideas that lead men to sort of, they're really that scare men into giving up some of their power. It's not exactly it might seem like what they're doing is sort of a more positive thing, but I think you have to look at really a lot of the motivations for that, and you'll see that it's a lot darker than a lot of people might think. I mean, all this talk about the Commonwealth, though, that brings me to my next point about why I think Hobbes holds a... So yeah, I think that's important when we're talking about the Commonwealth to really realize that. And that brings me actually to my next point, the Commonwealth, about why, I think Hobbes holds such a pessimistic and cynical view of humanity. And I think it's his firm belief that Commonwealth is best sort of ruled over, and even by definition has to be ruled over, a sort of common judge, a dictator, a sovereign that we give our power to, and he's basically going to be the big daddy deciding everything. And I think we could talk about, how he talks about, how monarchy is, in his eyes, the best sort of government because it's free from a lot of like man's passions. You might think that, the monarchy is ultimately going to be, just the judgment of one man, which, yeah, that's a valid criticism of Hobbes, that he believes that, if the best government really is just a monarchy, then wouldn't that just mean that sovereign is still in the state of nature since there's no one really being the sovereign over him? So yeah, that's a flawed system. But I think it is rather negative that, even disregarding sort of larger social contract or larger governmental decisions, even on sort of the small scale, that contract between man and man, Hobbes thinks that, humanity is best served with that sort of larger dictatorial ruler. So, even in, Hobbes in the text even says that, but, not even just in sort of this larger civil society, but also really just in sort of man-on-man decisions and sort of contracts between men. Hobbes believes that there still needs to be that larger power, or else, humans won't honor that agreement. He says, in the text, I'll pull out the big book for this one and show you I got the text. Because the bonds of words are too weak to bridle men's ambition, avarice, anger, and other passions, without the fear of some coercive power, which is in the condition of mere nature, where all men are equal and judges of justice upon their own fears, cannot possibly be supposed. And therefore he performeth first, but does betray himself to his enemy, contrary to the right, and defending his title and means of living. But in the civil estate, where there is power set up to constrain those that would otherwise violate their faith, that fear is no more reasonable, and for that cause he which by the covenant is to perform first is obliged to do so. And so essentially Hobbes is saying in that if left to our own devices, to our own judgments, humans will never honor their obligations. They'll never honor their deals, and that's why we really can't have a society. But under a commonwealth, when there is that larger power to coerce and by fear, these imply to coerce humans by fear, then they'll honor their social agreements. So that says, I think, really, sort of to tie this up, that says something very negative about not just humanity not being able to honor each other, not being able to sort of be trustworthy without a common judge to preside over them, but also I think it's very telling that the way that common power is supposed to rule over them is by fear, and that's the best way to get men to sort of cooperate in society is that fear motivation. So I think, I mean, ultimately, I think that's very telling. I think that proves that Hobbes has a sort of very pessimistic, a very cynical look at mankind. He doesn't think he thinks that we are able to function without being ruled over by fear. And he thinks that we are ultimately selfish creatures, that if we don't have that sort of larger power presiding over us, then it's all just going to go to hell. But I can already hear, in conclusion, I think that Hobbes, in his very cynical view of human nature, and sort of the way that he sees that influences how humans cooperate with each other in society, I think that reveals some disturbing ideas that complicate how many might think the function of human society, sort of operates. And I think that has some troubling implications. If the goal of society is really to ensure that we don't enter the state of conflict, the state of war, and hurt each other, then what are the implications of sort of these government programs and these aspects of society that we think are sort of are primarily altruistic? What would Hobbes think of the modern welfare state? Would he think its foundation, it could be argued really, in the welfare state, is built on it could be built on Hobbesian ideals. That power that's sort of given up via wealth redistribution and social programs is, that could be seen as a means of essentially making sure that the poor aren't put in this condition where they feel their obligations aren't met and we don't enter a state of war. So it could really just be this idea that we're laying down some power in order to not kill themselves. I think, personally, as a fan of the welfare state, I think that's very troubling. But what about you? I want to hear about what you guys think. Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you guys. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and join me next week when we'll discuss another famous contractarian, John Locke.